Welcome to the VO2 Lounge, a podcast dedicated to exploring the science behind current fitness trends. I'm not a sports scientist or a doctor, just an engineer with a passion for exercise performance. I spend hours delving into various sources and sit down a few times a month to discuss various topics, breaking down papers, articles and publications to better understand them, saving you from endless internet scrolling. How fast do we lose muscle when we start working out? We're going to go through the effects of bed rest, which are the most extreme example of atrophy-inducing situation. We're going to go through 2 months and 2 weeks off, and that's complete cold turkey still. We're going to go through intermittent training and reductions in volume and how that will influence muscle deterioration over the long term. We're going to address the muscle memory concepts and whether it is what we once believed or whether there is new evidence suggesting that muscle memory still exists, definitely exists, but how exactly, what is the method of action of said muscle memory, and then some practical applications and what you can do to ensure that if you've got a planned or unplanned period of detraining on the horizon, what you should do to maintain as much muscle mass throughout that period. Now, strength training increases muscular strength, induces hypertrophy, and provides numerous other positive health benefits, including improved functional ability, cardiometabolic risk profile, and general well-being. Strength training is therefore recommended as an interventional strategy for general population and not just to look buff. There are often times in people's lives where training will be interrupted. This could be because of life catching up with you or the opposite reason of going on holiday, for example. A typical strength and hypertrophy program for untrained or intermediately trained adults involves training all major muscle groups with 2 to 4 sets of 8 to 10 exercises for 3 to 12 repetitions with 2 to minutes rest between sets, carried out over 2 to 4 times per week. They can often include a warm-up, stretching, resulting in them often exceeding over an hour. Now, although this is not as time consuming as endurance training, it's still considerable amount of time and effort that you may not always be able to keep up or have equipment available to provide adequate stimulus. So what does the science say about losing muscle mass? Now, let's start off with the most extreme example of a atrophy-inducing scenario, which is bed rest. Although the person listening to this is more likely that they will still be moving, this provides a useful worst-case scenario, and I acknowledge that there will be some people listening to this episode for the purpose of they have got maybe a planned operation or unplanned operation that they are concerned about and would like to know how do they mitigate the atrophy that is going to occur during this bed rest period. So a paper titled Skeletal Muscle Disuse Atrophy is not attenuated by dietary protein supplementation in healthy older men. Now, this study investigated the impact of dietary protein supplementation on muscle preservation during a short period of limb immobilization in healthy older men. The researchers hypothesized that providing a protein supplement twice daily would help attenuate muscle loss during this period. The study involved 23 healthy older men, with one group receiving protein supplementation and the other not receiving any, during a 5-day one-legged knee immobilization period. Now, the protein supplement contained 20.7 grams of protein, 9.3 grams of carbohydrates, and 3 grams of fat. So somewhat typical, really, of some protein supplements. You can get more leaned out versions, but essentially a protein shake. Contrary to the hypothesis, the findings indicate that protein supplementation did not attenuate the observed muscle loss during the 5-day immobilization period. Both the group receiving the protein supplement and the control group without supplementation experienced substantial decrease in muscle mass and strength, with no significant differences between the two groups. The study concludes by highlighting the importance of considering exercise, physical activity, and potentially other nutritional compounds, such as creatine or omega-3 fatty acids, as complementary strategies to support muscle maintenance during periods of disuse. The role of dietary strategies in facilitating rehabilitation following disuse is also emphasized, encouraging future research in the area. So How much mass and strength did they lose? Well, reading of the graph, they saw about 7.5% reduction in single leg strength and 1.5% reduction in quad cross-sectional area. Now, I don't know how much this transfers to an actual weight, because you don't know what they're starting off as and the percentage of everything. But essentially, what was most interesting for me is, as they've said, contrary to popular belief, the supplementation of protein without the stimulus of exercise is still not enough to preserve muscle mass. So going cold turkey on exercising and just supplementing it with an increased amount of protein is not sufficient to maintain all of your gains. So it promotes the fact that still some kind of exercise needs to be performed to help induce this. Now, good for most people is that you're not going to go on complete bed rest. Even moving around, walking around throughout your daily chores, lifting a mug is enough stimulation to enhance the effect of preserving muscle. And it's the fact that the muscle is not being used at all that is leading to this drastic rate of atrophy. So next, let's look at a less severe protocol and assume you are able to move, but the duration is longer, such as 8 weeks, which is going to be more typical of an individual taking a break from the gym. A study titled AKT Signaling through GSK3 Beta, mTOR, and FOXO1 is involved in human skeletal muscle hypertrophy and atrophy. Now, this study is two-pronged as it investigated the way up and the way down, so muscle gain and muscle loss. The study investigates the regulation of skeletal muscle size in humans, focusing on the interplay between anabolic and catabolic signaling pathways. Specifically, the role of AKT and its downstream targets in muscle hypertrophy and atrophy was examined. The researchers conducted measurements in human quadricep muscle biopsies taken after 8 weeks of hypertrophy stimulating resistance training and atrophy stimulating detraining. In the hypertrophy phase, there was approximately a 10% increase in muscle size, which is quite impressive if you think about it. 8 weeks of resistance training and there's a 10% increase in muscle size. Now, whether this is completely contractile tissue or if a large amount of this could be just fluid, hard to say, but accompanied by elevated levels of phospho-AKT, phospho-GSK3 beta, and phospho-mTOR, indicating activation of the anabolic pathways. On the other hand, the detraining period resulted in a 5% decrease in muscle size relative to the post-training size, with the reduced levels of all three previous mentioned things, and indicating diminished anabolic signaling. An increase in FOXO1 suggests that the upregulation of the catabolic signaling. So they've clearly here, you can see how obviously diet is not mentioned here, but clearly a extremely potent signaling factor is the training status. Is the individual stimulating the muscle to grow or to maintain itself, or is the individual not providing a stimulus to that muscle? Because a 5% reduction in muscle size is now pretty drastic. I mean, it's half the rate at which it was gained, because 8 weeks on, 8 weeks off, half the reduction, but still, it's a large amount of muscle loss. This gives us much better insight into what is likely to happen to us on a 2-month break, as these individuals are still mobile and were trained to some extent, rather than going from untrained to bedridden states. Possibly the worst type of individuals to go on bed rest, which was the first study. These individuals were untrained and I think somewhat elderly, not like they were in their 80s, but they weren't 20 years old. So bringing it down to what is probably going to be the most common period of detraining, 2 weeks. The study, titled Resistance Training Induced Elevations in Muscle Strength in Trained Men, are maintained after 2 weeks of detraining and not differently affected by whey protein supplementation, gives insight into this. The study conducted aimed to investigate the impact of 2 weeks of detraining period on resistance-trained men who had undergone a 4-week resistance training program. The participants divided into whey protein and carbohydrate supplement groups, followed a 4-day per week resistance training program for 4 weeks, followed by a 2-week detraining period, and finally a 4-week training period, also a retraining period. Throughout the 10-week study, leg press strength was consistently elevated. Importantly, there was no observed decrease in leg press strength after the 2-week detraining period in either the whey protein or carbohydrate supplement groups. Notably, although not statistically significant, both groups appeared to retain lean mass after a retraining phase. These findings suggest that a short-term period of detraining lasting only 2 weeks may not compromise lower body strength in young resistance-trained men. Interestingly, the study implies that a use of 25 grams of whey protein post-exercise did not differentially affect the retention of muscular strength during the detraining phase. However, individual responses to detraining and retraining may vary, underscoring the importance of personalized considerations in exercise and supplementation regimes. So, you've got both kind of factors here. The protein post-exercise not differentially affecting the retention of muscular strength during the detraining phase just shows to you that protein is almost because it is quite literally used to build it. If there's no stimulation to build the muscle or retain the muscle, then clearly the protein is just going to float away and be used to just fuel the body generally, eventually at some point. So the key here is, even if you are going away, it looks to be like, even if you are a powerlifter or even a bodybuilder lifting a substantial weight, just maintaining something like body weight squats or press ups for just that 2-week period and trying to target all the muscles a little bit is clearly going to be the best way to prioritize and maintain any muscle mass you're trying to. Given that I've just mentioned there at the end this importance of intermittent training, let's move on to that itself and see how this can work. If we look at a study titled Effects of Periodic and Continued Resistance Training on Muscular CSA and Strength in Previously Untrained Men, we get an idea that these small breaks in training do not have much of an overall effect of strength and muscle mass outcomes in the long term. The study aimed to investigate muscle adaptations to retraining after short-term detraining by comparing continuous and interrupted resistance training in previously untrained men. 15 young men were divided into 2 groups containing training and retraining. Both groups engaged in high-intensity bench press training. Now, the continuous training group trained continuously for 15 weeks, while the retraining group trained for 6 weeks, underwent a 3-week detraining period, and then resumed training at week 10. After the initial training phase, both groups exhibited significant increases in 1 repetition max and cross-sectional areas of biceps, bicep brachii, and pectoral major muscles, as measured by magnetic resonance imaging. Now, these improvements were comparable between the 2 groups. Magnetic resonance imaging may have just gone over some people's head, just an MRI essentially. Now, during the subsequent continuous training phase, the continuous training group experienced continuous increases in muscle CSA and 1 rep max, contractile cross-sectional area, However, the rate of muscle adaptations was lower after the last 6 weeks of training compared to the initial phase. In contrast, the retrained group / the break group did not show significant decreases in muscle cross-sectional area and 1 rep max after the 3-week detraining period. Moreover, the increase in muscle contractile surface area observed after the training were similar to those observed after the initial training phase. Ultimately, both groups demonstrated similar improvements in 1 rep max and total muscle size after the full 15-week training period. The results suggest that 3-week detraining period does not hinder muscle adaptations compared to continuous 15-week training. The study implies that interrupted training with a short detraining phase may be an effective approach without compromising overall muscle gains. So again, sort of backing up what the 2 weeks detraining suggested, that short break isn't going to kill you. In fact, it might actually help you physically and mentally reset. Now, obviously, if your end goal, you're striving for a target, continuous training allows some more errors to some extent. It allows for you to something to come up and for you to take 2 days off that you weren't meant to and then come back to it. Whereas if you schedule in, for example, these 3 weeks, because to some extent I looked at this and thought, well, if someone's got extremely busy life, maybe a busy family life or something they can control, but at some point it does have to take priority, then you could look at this as being, you could do 3 weeks of really going at it and then taking a week or 2 weeks off, or just doing body weight stuff at home just to keep a stimulus there, and then go back to using the gym regularly for another 2-3 weeks, then taking another week or 2 weeks off. And you could sort of, it's going to take you probably longer because I know this is only 15 weeks, but it's going to definitely see improvements. So next we'll kind of move on to training volume and a reduction in volume, and what effect does it have on muscle mass and strength. Looking at a study titled Exercise Dosing to Retain Resistance Training Adaptations in Young and Older Adults will give us an idea in how reducing volume will affect your overall gains. This study represents a novel exploration into the dose-response efficacy of various resistance training prescriptions and aim to maintaining progressive adaptations, while also investigating potential age-related differences in maintaining requirements. Notably, once per week exercises dose generally prove sufficient to sustain positive neuromuscular adaptations. However, age-specific disparities emerged in the minimum dose needed to maintain muscle size. Among the young, a clear dose-response effect was observed, with 1/3 volume maintenance dosing leading to continued myofiber hypertrophy and strength gains, while 1/9 volume effectively preserved improvements. In contrast, older individuals did not maintain muscle size with either prescription, although both maintained strength gains. The study's primary objective was not merely to evoke typical changes in skeletal muscle following resistance training, but to assess optimal training volumes for retraining these benefits, particularly in older adults during periods of reduced exercise frequency. The training effects were explored, with findings aligning with existing literature indicating that strength gains from resistance training persist for several months even after training cessation. Interestingly, maintenance prescriptions of 1 day per week were effective for sustaining strength in both age groups, with the young continuing to increase strength beyond initial levels. They delved into muscle mass changes during detraining, highlighting a disassociation between muscle growth and strength gains. Both young and old retrained substantial improvements in specific strength throughout detraining, suggesting that persistence of non-muscle mass adaptations affecting strength performance. Now, the older group maintained a specific strength above pre-training young subjects throughout detraining, underscoring the enduring impact of a relatively short period of heavy resistance training on neuromuscular function. The study investigated the dose-response efficacy of maintenance prescriptions in preventing reversal of the myofiber type shift induced by resistance training. While approximately half the shift reverted by 16 weeks of detraining, 1/3 maintenance dose fully preserved the shift, emphasizing the importance of dosage in maintaining specific myofiber adaptations. In conclusion, the study highlights the positive effects of resistance training, recommending it's a primary intervention strategy to combat the detrimental impacts of sarcopenia, particularly among aging population. The findings indicate that progressive resistance training should sustained indefinitely for the health or functional status of all individuals, with attention to age-specific maintenance dose requirements. This is something you will see pushed and given an extreme amount of airtime on podcasts such as the Peer Tier Drive, because simply it preserves muscle and builds muscle better than anything else you could possibly do. No diet is going to give you the ability to hold a 3-year-old, 4-year-old and pick them up off the ground at 80, whereas resistance training simply will or should enable it. Let's not say will, because there's so many other factors, but it's going to have a greater effect than any other intervention possible. And for one straight out of the science of bro, and has plenty of anecdotes going around to support it, and for quite a long time it was thought to be proven in science, with studies suggesting that muscle nuclei gained during training are permanent. This is muscle memory. Let's just take an article in the Journal of Physiology, for example, titled "Muscle Nuclei Remember to Cheat Death" from 2013. It ends with the following passage. Taken together, these data suggest that 1. Once you acquire a myonucleus, it's essentially permanent, and 2. More nuclei translate into greater capacity for regrowth, which presumably translates into enhanced muscle strength and or speed. These observations have significant public health implications, especially with regards to resistance exercise in the young and potentially to reduce the risk of sarcopenia during aging. There are also potential ramifications for the sporting community. All athletes acquire their myonuclei through persistent hard work, but some individuals can unfairly supplement their pool by cheating with anabolic steroid use. Since the benefits of steroid administration may persist well after the circulating hormone levels are returned to baseline, it may be very hard to catch violators. Obtaining muscle biopsies from athletes to determine if they have ill-gotten nuclei is invasive, unethical, akin to assault, and likely to be ambiguous. This study reveals a potential new hurdle in terms of race between athletes and ethics, and others, a demoralizing realization that perhaps some cheaters may prosper. So from this, you would think that you will always have the enhanced ability to regain muscle mass, and it's quite an interesting concept, because I had always personally thought about this in the sense of a natural situation, but I had never really thought about it as, say, someone starts cycling or weightlifting at 18, or starts, say, at 16, does 2 years naturally, then at 18 to 20 does another 2 years enhanced, then thinks, right, I'm actually quite good, I want to compete at this, but I need to do it clean as to not get banned or caught by anti-doping. So they clear their system of the prohibited drugs, but maintain this ability to build a greater amount of muscle, or in cycling have a higher FTP, for example. Now, whether it translates to FTP, because it's the same thing, and to an extent you've got this concept of like a fitness memory, effectively. But we're talking about muscle mass, so we'll keep to that. I had never really thought about it in that way, so let's continue. But if we look at a paper titled "Muscle Mass and Strength Gains Following 6 Months of Resistance-Type Exercise Training Are Only Partially Preserved with 1 year with Autonomous Exercise Continuation in Older Adults," published in 2019, we get a new and different idea on all of this, which was completely new to me. So, the systematic review and meta-analysis aim to evaluate myonuclear and satellite cell content in human and rodent skeletal muscle undergoing hypertrophy, atrophy, or detraining, with a focus on unraveling the concepts of muscle memory and myonuclear permanence. The findings revealed intriguing patterns across both species, shedding light on complexities and muscle adaptations. In human skeletal muscle, a consistent trend emerged showing lower myonuclear and satellite cell content during atrophy, aging, and post-detraining. Notably, the decrease observed during detraining signified a return to pre-training levels. Age-related differences were apparent, with young adults experiencing a more pronounced decrease in type 1 cross-sectional area following detrained compared to the older adult. These observations show the influence of age on skeletal muscle plasticity. Now, rodent studies provided additional layers to the narrative. Myonuclear content in rodents exhibited resilience, remaining elevated during detraining following overload-induced hypertrophy. However, the stability of myonuclei in rodents was less clear due to limited study numbers and variations in experimental design. The magnitude of myonuclear elevation in rodents surpassed that in humans, suggesting species-specific differences in dynamics of the muscle adaptations. Now, challenging the prevailing notion of myonuclear permanence during detraining in humans, the meta-analysis indicated a clear return to baseline levels. This finding raised questions about enduring nature of myonuclei acquiring during hypertrophy. The rodent model, while showing some retention, also hinted at variability in myonuclear dynamics. Despite the intriguing findings, the review acknowledged several limitations. The evidence supporting muscle memory remained largely anecdotal due to the scarcity of human animal studies. Heterogeneity across studies involving different muscles and varied rates of hypertrophy posed challenges in resulting interpretation. Now, this may be leading you to think, well, clearly, I'm a fine example. I went to the gym, I took some time off, and then I regained the muscle much faster the second time. So this is not to say muscle memory does not exist. So let's look at epigenetic factors, which have also been researched as well as in studies such as human skeletal muscle possesses an epigenetic memory of hypertrophy, published in 2018. Just as a quick note, epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and the environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes actually work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change your body reads the DNA sequence. And gene methylation is a chemical modification of the DNA and other molecules that may be retained as cells divide to make more cells. When found in DNA, methylation can alter gene expression. Now, this study delves into the unexplored realm of epigenetic memory in adult human skeletal muscle following encounters with growth stimuli, effectively resistance training. Employing genome-wide analysis, including DNA methylation, profiling of 850,000 CpGs, and gene expression assessment, the research investigated the dynamics of muscle hypertrophy, return to baseline muscle mass during unloading, and subsequent hypertrophy during reloading. A significant revelation emerged as the study uncovered an increased frequency of hypomethylation across the genome after reloading, surpassing the levels observed during initial loading phase. This shift in methylation patterns pointed towards a potential epigenetic memory associated with the reloading phase. The genes affected maintained their hypomethylated status even during unloading, where muscle mass reverted to control levels. This persistence suggested a lasting memory encoded in the methylation signatures of these genes following earlier hypertrophy. In summary, the research sheds light onto critical role of epigenetics in muscular hypertrophy and memory, the identification of previously studied genes, their persistent hypermethylation and enhanced gene expression across different phases of the muscle loading and unloading provided a foundation for further exploration into mechanisms underlying genetic memory in adult human skeletal muscle. Now, essentially to me, it's a kind of twofold, because you've got studies saying that the nuclei are back to baseline after, say, for example, a year. So it could be that if you return to training within, say, 6 months, you would see a faster muscle memory effect. And then long term, say a year, 2 years, then it is this methylation or hypermethylation of these cells that is resulting in the muscle memory effect much further down the line. So where does this leave you? Hopefully, given all this, it's clear to you don't need to worry about muscle mass and strength loss in the short term, say for example a 2-week holiday. And in the long term, a bit of resistance training can go a long way to maintaining the muscle mass and strength that you have. Has this changed your view on breaks? Let me know how you will be going about your next holiday or training phase via email or on Discord. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2 Lounge at gmail.com or on the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it is goodbye.